Thank you all for joining us for the Atkinson's Objects of the Month talk. Anybody who doesn't know me, my name's Jo Chamberlain. I'm the Heritage and Participation Officer for the Atkinson in Southport. So today's talk has come about because we've currently got an exhibition running called Courage and Devotion, which opened on 26th of June. And part of the exhibition, well, the research for the exhibition, I contacted Aldon, who's been amazing and helped me so much with background research, images, etc. Checking Squadron colours, making sure I wasn't doing anything right, anything wrong. So, so thanks for that, Aldon. I owe you a pint or a lunch at some point in the future.
Yes, yes.
Yes to both. Okay, fair enough. I'm just going to quickly run through how the talk's going to run today. So the talk will run for about an hour. For the duration of the talk, we will turn your video and your audio off. However, if you do want to have any questions passed on to Aldon, there's a chat facility. So if you just type in your question on chat, and at the end of the talk, Aldon can have a quick look at that and answer anything that you may have forwarded on to him. So today's talk is looking at the history of RAF Woodvale and the Polish pilots that served there. And today's speaker is Aldon Ferguson, who is a military historian and a former Formby resident who specialises in the RAF and the USAF. So over to you, Aldon.
Thank you, Jo. Good. Okay. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to talk about 80 years of RAF Woodvale in 1 hour. So I'm going to cover as much as I can, but clearly it's going to be skipping across the surface rather than going into a lot of detail. But Jo has asked that I cover the Polish squadrons with as much detail as I can. So I will go into a certain amount of detail because they were there first and they were there during the actual war years. So moving into my involvement, just a quick introduction to myself. I've been involved with Woodvale since 1958 when I was a cadet. I joined the Air Cadet Squadron on the airfield. And as a result of my interest, it slowly evolved to people saying, when's your book coming out? And I said, what book? And they said, well, you have all this information about Woodvale. Why don't you write a book? So back in '74, we put a book together. It was 36 pages. It was typed and then duplicated on a rank Xerox. It sold at 7 and 6. And I couldn't get anybody to publish it, but the Merseyside Aviation Society came along and they said, we don't think we'll do it very well. But anyhow, they put it on the market. We sold 500 copies in 6 months. So we realized there was a market. So I thought, okay, let's go and do another one. So in 1980, we produced a much thicker one, which was 68 pages, and the interest continued. And as always, if you're writing a book, or as Jo has just been saying earlier before you all joined us, you set up an exhibition, you appeal for help, you get a certain amount as soon as you start the exhibition or as soon as you start the book, or sorry, you print the book, people come along and say, oh, I've got this, you haven't mentioned this. So we did the third book way back in 91. And this book is going to be available for sale in the Atkinson in Southport from probably tomorrow. They're actually in the mail now, or from me direct. So my involvement was brought up in Formby, went to school in Crosby, I went to Merchant Taylor School. My first work was in, well, I joined the RAF from school and then came out and became a surveyor. And I worked for Southport Waterhouse for a while in Liverpool, and then moved down to London to run the London office, and then never looked back in the end, set up my own business and maintained my interest in Woodvale and the units there ever since. I'm still involved with them and much wider military aviation. In fact, the week after next, I'm off to Iceland on a cruise, doing cruise lecturing on military subjects. So that's me. Why was Woodvale built? Well, the whole purpose of Woodvale was to protect Merseyside, but it was too late. The major blitz on Liverpool was on the date shown, August 1940 to May 1941. And these photographs show, the top left is obviously typical devastation in Liverpool. This is the remains of a corn exchange in Liverpool. The building, the tall building there is a Mersey tunnel ventilation shaft. The Merseyside Harbour Board building behind, and this is the Pacific Steam Navigation Company building, now a hotel, but it was totally blitzed. This picture here, this is what was John Lewis's store. That's the Adelphi Hotel after the Blitz. And this is Cook Street in Liverpool, looking up towards Castle Street, Town Hall to the right. And oddly enough, Sykes Waterhouse's offices were just on the left here. So the Blitz had hit Liverpool badly, and the only real fighter station which the RAF could provide at the time was down here in Cheshire at Cranage. And it was the only base in the northwest of England which had aircraft which were dedicated to night flying. But they didn't carry radar. They were totally reliant on ground control. We had very, very limited radar in this part of the country during the Blitz. And so the best way for them to actually detect the enemy bombers was to fly fairly low and go into areas like Liverpool and Manchester and see the aircraft silhouetted against the fires, or depending upon the conditions at night, whether they could see them. But it was Mark I eyeball, which was mostly the way that they were brought on to fight. It wasn't very successful. So Woodvale up here was designed and built a bit too late. There were other airfields, of course. There's quite a few shown on this map, but there were some fighters at Liverpool Airport at Speke. There were some at Ringway here. There were some down at Tilstock, which is Shropshire, just off the picture. And there were some at Valley in Anglesey. But they were all day fighter squadrons. So except for the anti-aircraft guns, which of course were very numerous, the Blitz occurred with limited air defense at that time. So the whole idea was to make sure that didn't happen anymore. So sites were chosen for different airfields. And at the peak of the war, they were opening an airfield every 3 days in the UK. Before the war had started, we had a huge expansion program, and major RAF bases had been built with brick hangars and brick buildings, a bit like Sealand, some of the buildings at Sealand, where permanent buildings were constructed. As we got nearer to war, and as war broke out, we needed these airfields quickly. We didn't need permanent buildings. We needed just utility buildings to allow the war to be fought from them, but they were built just for the duration. And Woodvale is, in fact, the very last of what I would call the temporary airfields, which were built to last the duration of the war, not knowing when it was going to end, but assuming it wouldn't go on too long. So the site they chose for Woodvale is shown on this picture here. So we have the Formby bypass, which was built just before the war. The airfield, the runways are shown in pencil here on this drawing. That's the main runway, this one across here and one down here. And the main site was a golf course. It was the Liverpool Merchant Bank and Insurance Golf Course. And the golf clubhouse was down here by the railway line, not far from Freshfield Station. There's a farm here called New Bronk Farm, and some of the farm buildings were retained. Otherwise, the site was cleared, and the airfield, when it was opened, looked like this. It was only opened in December 1941, so you're seeing a lot of disturbed ground here, and of course it's sand. The average height above sea level of Woodvale is 13 feet, not very high. So the bypass stands out clearly, and they have made an effort to camouflage a runway. As you can see the end here, and the main site is located here. You've got the Liverpool Southport railway line, which borders it down on the seaward side, and the bypass, of course, on the east and the inland side. Everything was spread out because we were wary of attacks by the Germans. So here we have dispersals spread all around the edge of the airfield and all the way down the side of the railway as well. And the living accommodation I'll show in a moment was also dispersed. Another view looking the same way. The dates on this one, the 12th of February, 20th of August 1942, a little bit later on. What they've done here is they kept the outline of the fields as much as possible to try and disguise it from the air. But of course, an airfield is almost impossible to camouflage. You can see the markings on the runway, the hangar down here, which is still there by the dual carriageway. You can see they've painted the roof to break it up, but it's still very obvious what it is. And it's more obvious when you look down on a vertical shot like this. So you have the Liverpool Southport railway line there. And then when Woodvale was built, we had the Cheshire Lines railway, which runs across here. And Woodvale railway station is just here, which I'll pick out. Dual carriageway, as I say, is there. And then on this side of the road, the old Southport Road used to run from where the Southport Corporation buses stop here by the traffic lights for the what is now the Coast Road. And it goes past the Formby Hall Golf Club, and it winds round here, down to here. I mean, it goes to what is the Freshfield roundabout. Of course, no roundabout before the dual carriageway into Formby. So if you were driving from Liverpool to Southport, you drove through Formby and then wound your way along the country lanes. So what they did is they built all the living accommodation, and these are the individual living sites dispersed. So if they were attacked by the Germans from the air, then there was a good chance that most would survive. So at the Southport end, we have the sick quarters, and here we have what they call the communal site, where you have the officers' mess, the sergeant's mess, the airman's mess, and the associated living accommodation for them. And we had a WAF site down here, kept well away from the men as far as possible. And a lot of these people were issued with bikes. A lot of them had to walk. And so in many cases, they would have to walk to the guard room to be let in to the site, and then walk to wherever they were working around the site, or be taken around by truck. A lot of trucks and small buses were used. And at the peak of Woodvale, you would be getting probably over 1,000 personnel based there during World War II. The dispersal down in this area here, which is the Formby side, looked in a close-up more like this. We have a runway here, and the pointer is to show the pilots where to land. You land in front of the point. The taxiway, a hard taxiway round here, and dispersals which were surrounded by walls made out of sandbags. There was plenty of sand, so they made high walls about 8 feet high, and you have space for 2 aircraft. And you can see here, there's 2 aircraft down there, there's one there, there's one down here, 2 in that one, 2 there. So they were spread as far around as they could, and they continued. These lines were painted, thick bitumastic paint, so to try and make it look like the fields are still there. So this is Woodvale in the very early days, and this is what it looked like from an oblique view. This is the main gate in front, where they'd have a guard on duty. The bypass, nice and quiet, a single guy on a bike just there, and a track going across to the living sites here. And you're looking across towards the Southport line over here, the pine woods and the sea beyond. There's what's called a blister hangar here. There were 12 of these scattered around the airfield. The control tower, the original farm, New Bronx Farm. And next to it here is the garage and quarters for the crash crews. And that was a barn belonging to the farm. It was taken over and converted. The building here, which is now the officers' mess, was the station headquarters, and the guard room here to protect, guarding the whole of the base. The domestic fire station there, they have their own fire crew in case of domestic fires, and they had air raid shelters everywhere. Here's a typical air raid shelter. It's an open top, but if the alarm went, they had these spread around the airfield. People would jump into those and try and get maximum protection from enemy air attack. A close-up of the tower, looking a bit nearer, Spitfire parked here, and you're looking across at the railway. Here's that barn I mentioned, and that's the New Bronx Farm over here. Every airbase had a code and a signal square. So a lot of aircraft were flying with no radios. So you look down, and there was no point in putting WV because the enemy would know it's Woodvale. So they had a unique code, and it was OD for Woodvale during the war. They painted on the side of the tower this outline of the plan of the base. And they had a big sign because you could drive around the perimeter track one way or the other to the dispersals. But the dispersals, these are some of them here on this side. and the sign would say dispersal numbers 1 to whatever, 20 going around to the right, and 20 to 50 going around the other way. And that stayed there for a long time until they renovated the tower after the war, and they covered it up. But in 1975, they found it again. They were taking the render off the tower, and they had rendered over it, and they pulled it apart like this, took the render off it. It says flying control down here. And by using some of my photographs, they renovated that, and that actually became a feature on the tower for a long time. The tower's now been clad to make it more thermally efficient. So you can't see it anymore, sadly. Now, the dispersed sites, this is the WAF site here. They have their own mess and their own sleeping accommodation, obviously ablutions, etc. And then different little areas like this, where you'd have a group of airmen living. There's some more here, some more here, some more here. And this is the airfield in the distance and the dispersals around here. Some of these buildings were very, very basic. Some were built of brick, single skin of brick, with maybe a render on the outside and no insulation. Some of them were made of timber and were just covered in felt to keep them watertight. So the base wasn't even finished when the first Polish squadron arrived. And certainly the messes weren't finished. And so the officers' mess for the RAF personnel who were there, was this house here, known as Cavendish House. And this location, this is Woodvale railway station on the Cheshire Lines railway. And these are the platforms. That's one platform, and that's the other platform. And there was a bridge, a low bridge. And Ribble buses had quite a problem getting under it. They had to have special buses to get underneath it. And a goods yard, and a tremendous amount of material for Woodvale and personnel came by train to here. Cavendish House was requisitioned, taken over as the officers' mess for the RAF crews. Again, sorry, just to come back to this is now the coast road, and the traffic lights are here. And you come off the dual carriageway, you stop at the traffic lights, you turn left, and you go along what was the railway track to Ainsdale, past Pontins, round the Ainsdale roundabout, and on into Southport. This house remained for a long, long time after the war and reverted back to private use. But they separated the RAF and the Polish for several reasons, one of which was, of course, the Poles spoke in Polish, and they were a self-contained unit on the squadron. So initially, there wasn't room in this house for the RAF and the Polish. So, excuse me, they put the Polish into the golf clubhouse on what had been the golf course, which they had built the airfield on. And I have a pen sketch of it, but I cannot find it. But later I have a photograph which does depict it, and I'll show it to you. Once the purpose-built officers' mess and the sergeants' mess were built, then these buildings were then left back to private use. But the site was so vast, so many people on the base, they had a mobile canteens to go around to supply the drink and the food, and these vans would go around constantly, all the sites, and there were a lot of people living on the sites. And in the background there you see a typical building. They were heated with coke stoves, each individual one having its flue, single brick and corrugated asbestos roof, totally frowned upon now. Anyhow, the Germans knew Woodvale was there, and this is a Luftwaffe photograph. They called it Formby. Normally an air base was named after its nearest village, and they decided in their wisdom, I don't know why, but they called it Woodvale rather than Formby, after Woodvale, which is this area here. And this photograph was taken in May 1940, taken from considerable height, as you can see. But in May 1940, there were no, 1942. In May 42, there were fighter squadrons on Woodvale. But nobody knew that that Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft was there. No aircraft took off to try and intercept it. So it clearly shows the 3 runways. Why 3 runways? Well, aircraft were very light during this period of time. They were still being developed, obviously, and fighters were light aircraft together with all the training aircraft. And the wind around the UK obviously blows in different directions. Predominantly, it's from the southwest, which is really this direction. So this runway here is nearest to being into wind. But what it does is allows you 6 different alternatives depending upon the wind direction. So if the wind is blowing from the sea towards the land, then this runway we would want to use, and you land and take off into the wind. So the aircraft would land at this end of the runway, slow down, stop, and then taxi to wherever they were. The Germans had annotated it. They're showing flak anti-aircraft guns here. They're not picking out the individual living sites. They're only interested if they were going to bomb it. They wanted to bomb the aircraft and the airfield to put it out of action. But this is all in German here. So the very first Polish squadron arrives, and it comes in December 1941. The place is still under construction. There's a lot of sand blowing all over the place. But the squadron had been fighting down in 11 Group, which was the southeast of England, which is the nearest to continental Europe. And that's where all the fighter action took place, escorting bombers going over into Europe, and also intercepting bombers coming from Germany, Holland, France, this sort of area once they were overrun by the Germans. And they took big losses. They were losing aircrew, they were losing aircraft. So they only allowed them to stay fighting down in the really busy area down in the southeast for maximum of 6 months. And then they withdrew them to places like Woodvale and replaced them with a fresh squadron, which had been training and replacing its aircrew and replacing its aircraft in much safer locations like Woodvale. This was a demonstration flypast they did, which was pretty good considering the lack of training, but it was done for a purpose, for a special visit, which I'll come on to. The CO, they were initially you'd get an RAF commander, but very quickly they tried to make them all into Polish squadrons. There were several of them, and in fact, during the Battle of Britain, the squadron which had the most kills, that is, shot down more German aircraft than any other RAF squadron, was a Polish squadron. It was 303 Squadron, the highest scoring. So 308 had been at Northolt, which is just west of London, still an RAF station on the A40. And they came in with the Polish aircrew. They were all people who had escaped either immediately before or during the German occupation of Poland. And they were vehemently anti-German. And that is probably why they fought so ferociously against the Germans during the battle and after. So all the people you're seeing here are Polish. This is a Polish Air Vice Marshal who came several times to visit and to reward them. And they flew Spitfires at Woodvale. And what they would do here is they would get new aircrew coming in who were being trained. Polish people were continually trying to escape. They have their own emblem. It's a red and white checker on the side of the engine there. Possibly shows up on some future photographs. So they would get the new aircrew in, they would get new aircraft in, they would get newer aircraft as new aircraft were being developed. And the Spitfire was being constantly developed during the war into a faster and a more efficient aircraft. They would train onto them, but simultaneously they would be keeping a vigil on the skies over the Merseyside area, the whole of the northwest, and they were scrambled many, many times to try and intercept incoming German aircraft. Many times they were false alarms. Many times they just failed to find them. And fortunately, we're lucky. We've got quite a few photographs of the squadrons. The CO there, Wing Commander Janus on the left-hand side. And you can see the different uniforms which they're wearing. And the life jackets they all wore, especially as we were near to the sea, in case they came down in the sea. So these are Polish squadrons. Now that was 308 was the first squadron. Then 315 came in as the second squadron in April 1942. Again, it came up from the southeast. 308 went back to fight the war down in the southeast. 315 squadron had its own godmother, who was the Countess of Jersey, and this is her here. Her name was Virginia Sherrill, and she came with a friend, and in fact quite a few friends, as you can see on this bottom picture here, to a squadron day. This was the 14th of August 1942, and they were entertained by the Polish and by the RAF there. They were obviously quite an RAF contingent as well, and they set up a very small air display. They had several aircraft about to take off when suddenly there was a scramble. And a scramble is when there's an alert, an enemy aircraft has been spotted somewhere approaching the area. So they scrambled 2 aircraft from Woodvale to go and try and intercept this German aircraft. Often they were heading towards Liverpool, Manchester, or also Barrow, because Barrow was a big shipbuilding place, still is, but much bigger during World War II. And in many of the cases where Woodvale aircraft were scrambled, they were after aircraft, either photo reconnaissance aircraft or bombers looking for Barrow. And on this particular day, this gentleman here, by the name of Stembrowski, was one of those 2 pilots. And the aircraft he flew is still flying. And this is a photograph of it with a Polish emblem on it. It made a return trip back to Woodvale in July 1999. And the gentleman on the left is a Polish gentleman who was ground crew at Woodvale during World War II. I would doubt he is still with us. This was taken 22 years ago. And the pilot was called Charlie Brown. But on the right-hand side, you got Stemboski with 2 WAFs sitting on the side of the aircraft. But he, on that day, took off to intercept, the very same day the Countess of Jersey was there, in this aircraft, although this is a painting of it, but the actual aircraft is still worthy, which is quite a feat. And he was rewarded, and 3 pilots were actually decorated by Air Vice Marshal Ujeski, who is here. And that's Stemboski. He is a very tall guy. And you can see the wings. These are Polish wings on their uniform. And you see it says Poland on their shoulders. And if they were in the RAF, they would have an RAF pair of wings. But the Polish had a different style of wings. And so that differentiates them. Otherwise, uniforms were similar, except for the hats. And Ujeski came at the bottom left there. He's reviewing a guard of honor outside the guard room. And all those 3 pilots scored kills of German aircraft whilst they were based at Woodvale during the war. Then 315 continued. You can see the work. They would do all the maintenance of the aircraft here at Woodvale. That canteen got all over the place on the airfield and off the airfield. And you can see the fuel tanker to refuel the aircraft up here. Anything which would work was pressed into service because we needed hundreds and hundreds of every single bit of equipment. So that was what we call a Bowser, a petrol tanker, refueling the aircraft. And this is 317 Squadron, which was the 3rd of the Polish squadrons to come to Woodvale. And one replaced the other. And they would be at Woodvale for about 6 months. They would build up quite a rapport with the local people. They were going to Southport and Liverpool for a social time because the chances of them being scrambled was pretty rare. And they would have a standby flight, a readiness flight with a couple of pilots and the ground crew, and the aircraft ready, loaded and armed, fueled, ready to go in case they were needed. And they were needed. So here we have Smalski, the CO on the left. These are all Polish airmen. They're in the briefing room in the top right. And they did a good amount of protective work around the northwest. They did keep the Germans at bay. They also did some convoy protection work as well for the convoys coming into Liverpool. They would fly over them, make sure there were no long-range German aircraft coming in to attack them. And they would also do some spotting for submarines to make sure there were no enemy submarines around. But of course, it's in a war. We're in a war zone. You're going to get casualties. And sadly, we did. We got plenty of them. And the graves on the top left there are in Our Lady's Church in Formby. And in fact, there's 5 bodies in those 4 graves. The other 2 pictures are of now Rocky, who was killed in a flying accident north of Lancaster. Wesolowski, the CO of the 1st Squadron, 308 Squadron, he's in the N grave, sadly. He collided with another aircraft of his squadron. The 2 of them crashed. He was killed. The other pilot survived. But another pilot in his squadron had died in a previous accident, and only part of his body was recovered. So they got permission to put the 2 from the same squadron into that grave. And the inscription on the grave gives their names. And these are the other 3, including Naroki, who were killed on active duty at at Woodvale. There were others as well, of course. The Polish community still honour these graves at an annual ceremony. It's got the Polish Force insignia, the bald eagle or the eagle with wings on the gravestone. Otherwise, they're very similar to the RAF, the British Commonwealth War Grave Commission. The picture on the right, I'm pretty sure, is Gores Lane in Formby, and they're marching from Woodvale up to Our Lady's Church, past some thatched cottages for the actual funeral. The worst accident at Woodvale occurred in 1944, and it was an aircraft. This is just to demonstrate the type of aircraft. This is a B-24 Liberator. It's an American manufactured aircraft, and we use them for both bombing and for Coastal Command. And this is a Coastal Command Liberator on the ground at Woodvale. But it was one of these coming in from East Anglia when they had telephoned Woodvale to say they were on their way coming, or they were about to depart. And Woodvale said, no, don't come. We have a low fog, we have a sea fog across the airfield. Wait until the fog's gone and then come. But they came anyhow. Whilst they had some lighting on the airfield, very little, there was no approach lighting, there was no radar. The aircraft made an approach, and by the time it could see the ground, it was lined up wrong. It was actually lined up on a taxiway and not on the runway. So the pilot opened the throttle. There were 20 people on board. He did another circuit and came in and again found he was in the wrong place. So he turned very, very steeply to the side and the wing hit the ground. The aircraft was still traveling at over 100 miles an hour because it was flying. It was at flying speed. It cartwheeled into the ground. 3 crew were killed instantly. A lot of them were burned. 4 of the crew who they managed to get out alive died in the station sick quarters. And the other 13 who survived were all rushed off to the Promenade Hospital in Southport, where they did survive. Fortunately, the aircraft was a complete wreck, and it ended up right at the Ainsdale end, Seeker's Farm it's called. And in fact, there's a lady who may very well be with us today, but she lives there still, and she was age 7, and she can remember this accident happening. There was a ceremony to commemorate it several years ago. It could have been 2014, I'm not sure, but we do have some pictures of it. So that was really sad. Many American aircraft came into Woodvale. Many visitors came in, as I will show. But the main reason the American aircraft came in was because of this place, the Palace Hotel at Birkdale. And this was taken over as an American Red Cross club. Clearly, during the war, a hotel was not going to be used as a hotel. People were not going on holiday. But for those of you who remember the Palace Hotel, that massive, great Victorian pile, for those of you who don't know it, the road across the front here is Westcliff Road, and that's the sea beyond it. It had its own railway station here on the Cheshire Lines Railway, and this is orientated so you go to the right towards the town centre and left towards Ainsdale. The road at the back here is called Palace Road, obviously, oddly enough, after the Palace Hotel, and that's an extension of Rotten Row, which runs off to the right, and this road is Weld Road, runs down to Birkdale Station. Now, the American Red Cross Club took over buildings and purpose-built some all over the UK for rest and recreation, R&R for the American crews. And this one has got the reputation, or is believed to be the first one, where they allowed a whole American aircraft crew to rest together, to relax together, because of the different ranks. Because some of the gunners and some of the ranks flying these aircraft, the same with the British, they were not officers. So they were segregated in their different messes, and they were segregated in some of the Red Cross clubs. Here, they would come as a crew, and they were allowed to rest, have a good time. They had American magazines, American food, American drink, American newspapers, and hostesses to look after them, mostly local girls who would act as hostesses, totally above board, totally organized. The bottom right picture shows a group of American airmen on a horse landau being taken around Southport. And Joe told me just before we started today that they have access to a photo album taken during the war of the hotel. The Sunnyside Hotel on the promenade at Southport was another of the clubs, and airmen would come to both the Palace and to the Sunnyside Hotel from Burton Wood and also from Wharton. They were two huge American bases. So the enemy did show its face in the northwest a lot, not just the night bombing over Merseyside, but there were several interceptions, and the first one was way back in February 1942. The base had only been open for just over 2 months when a flying officer, Dolicher, and a Sergeant Marrick, flying officer, an officer, sergeant, a non-commissioned officer, but they were both pilots, they were both flying Spitfires. They intercepted one of these Ju-88s over Lancaster, but they were flying old Mark I Spitfires, which were not terribly fast. They lost the enemy in cloud, but they did actually get some shots at it, and they saw bits coming off it, and they think they put one engine out, but they never actually managed to shoot it down. So they claimed it as damaged. And then the same thing happened, but over Walney Island, which is near Barrow, only 10 days later in February 1941, where another crew from 315 Squadron hit another of his aircraft, but again, it escaped. But Strombrowicz, here again, did actually manage to shoot one down. It crashed into the sea, and 3 were shot down by Woodville aircraft only. There were only 5 raids on Liverpool and the docks and Birkenhead after Woodvale opened. So there were very, very few night raids. So generally what was happening, you get either a single aircraft like this one, or possibly a group of 3 aircraft coming over to do random bombing raids. And that's what they were up against. They had to try and intercept these aircraft. So that was the first kill. 315 Squadron, lots of scrambles, lots of contact with the enemy. They'd had a disastrous time before they came up to Woodvale, and that they were flying out of Northolt and also Exeter down in the southwest. And they were flying in really bad weather, and they lost the airfield. They couldn't find it in the bad weather. 10 aircraft ran out of fuel and had to crash land, and the crew bailed out. 2 pilots were killed, including the commanding officer. 3 were badly injured. 10 aircraft were lost. Only 2 aircraft landed safely. They did re-equip it with a certain number of aircraft, and then they brought them up to Woodvale, new pilots, new aircraft to retrain. That's what was happening during the war. Big problems. But Woodvale was gaining in importance. Not only did it have the Polish squadrons there, it had also up to 3 other squadrons there, acting as cooperation squadrons, working with the Navy and the Army. It also became a sector control station, or a sector operations center, sector operations room, SOR. And the area outlined there is the area which Woodvale was the sector control room, which is just like you see on the TV programs, which I'll show in a second, was responsible for coordinating all the different fighter squadrons on all the different fighter bases in that area. And there were a lot of fighter bases in Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, Durham, across Shropshire, part of Staffordshire, North Wales, and even the Isle of Man as well. There were 3 airfields on the Isle of Man. And there was a command post, a command room, operations room, which is the top left. It's still there. It's in Broad Lane. A tower on the left has gone, and it's now a travellers' camp. And I suggest you don't go to it. They're not particularly friendly. It would have looked like the picture on the right-hand side. It would have had a big earth embankment around it to protect it from blast. And that was operated throughout the war, and it was called the Woodville Sector. And they were responsible, as I say, for controlling the sector. Did vary in size, and at some point it became much smaller as stations across in the east side of the country took over their areas. But the map I showed was the largest area it took. The one at the bottom right is Digby, which is in Lincolnshire, and inside it had the plotting table, and this is what would have been at Woodvale. This is how it would have looked. It would have told you the weather, the wind. It would have told you what squadrons were available on different airfields. And this shows Woodvale way over here and Digby, which is around here. And it's showing the different plots of the incoming aircraft and the aircraft which are going up to intercept the incoming aircraft. You would have seen this on Battle of Britain and various things like that. So that was only in operation from 1942 through to 1945. After that, it was left derelict and it's a real mess now. But it's amazing how well it was built, the fact that it still exists as a shell. Not only do we have Polish people, air crew and ground crew, complete Polish squadrons at Woodvale, and RAF crews and Fleet Air Arm crews, we had WAFs as well. And this is a photograph of one of the WAF contingents marching in Lord Street on a parade. And they had their own specific area, living area on site, but otherwise they would be doing all sorts of different jobs right across the entire site with the men at Woodvale. And the other squadrons which were coming in, we had a lot of support squadrons. So 285 was a cooperation, an army cooperation squadron, flying a mixture of aircraft. The top right is a Defiant, which proved to be totally useless as a fighter. It used to have a big gun turret on the back with a gun with a turret with 4 machine guns on it, like on a bomber. And it just didn't work. It was too slow. So they took the turret off and they made it into a target tug. And they would fly that aircraft with what they call a sleeve target. It's like an air sock about a mile behind, and the anti-aircraft gunners would practice shooting at it. Or they would calibrate the anti-aircraft guns on the drogue. They would calibrate the searchlights on them, and the aircraft on the left is an Oxford, and they would fly around all the different army units all the way around the northwest of the country, cooperating with them. Whatever the army wanted them to do, more or less, they would do it. The numbers were growing. We had up to 5 squadrons at a time on the airfield. Sergeant's mess, a group of the sergeants out of the sergeant's mess. And by the very first Christmas, they were celebrating with a dance in the officers' mess, 25th of December, 1943. And that was only going to start at 9 o'clock. So I think that was probably quite an event that night. Also, they had in the airmen's mess, they had a stage, they had a full recreational area. They put on the Woodvale Follies, and this is a couple of photographs of the actual Follies. It's almost the same photograph, it's just the position of a trident here, which is a bit different, but thought I'd put them both up. So they'd entertain the troops. Also, Christmas, there's a tradition in the RAF where on Christmas Day, the officers serve the airmen. So the officers would go into the airmen's mess and they would act as waiters to serve the airmen. Didn't happen very often, but it did at Christmas, and it's a tradition. So also we had active squadrons. 256 came over flying Beaufighters at first and then Mosquitoes. It stayed at Woodvale for a long, long time, right through till September 1943, when it went to Malta, and it fought at Malta for a couple of years. And then moved on. But at Woodvale, it was doing a certain amount of protection of the area, a certain amount of cooperation. Sadly, the commanding officer of this squadron was also killed in a mid-air collision with a Wellington bomber over Bangor in North Wales in 1943, sadly. There was another squadron, or 2 squadrons, which were again specifically cooperation squadrons. This is an Oxford 116, and 776 Fleet Air Arm was what they call a fleet requirements unit. Of course, a lot of Navy ships were coming in and out of Liverpool, and they had Navy airfields also, Burscough, Inskip, Stretton, around the local area, and they needed cooperation for communications, for calibration, etc. But very, very close to Woodvale at Ainsdale was a Navy unit, and this is it, HMS Queen Charlotte, and this is the Ainsdale Lido, and the actual pre-war Lido building is here in the centre, and it was built as a beach Lido where people could get changed to go swimming. There'd be a snack bar, toilets, and the road onto the beach from Ainsdale Station is just off the picture to the right. There used to be a row of Victorian houses which were boarding houses, and there was a club there called Toad Hall for a long, long time. That's been demolished, and it's just off the picture. They were there when this was taken. They were requisitioned and they were used as accommodation for the Navy people here. Along the beach was a row of guns and rangefinders, and they would shoot at the drogues towed by the Fleet Requirements Squadron. I'll show you the aircraft in a second. Pontins, to show where we are, Pontins is here now. That locates it. The building remained for a long, long time. I remember the building very, very well after the war, but it has now been demolished. It's not there anymore. But 776, based at Woodvale and at Speke as well, cooperated with the Navy. They would fly these drogues close to Navy ships, and they would practice shooting at the drogues with the anti-aircraft guns on the ships to give them practice. And what they did is they would tip the bullets with paint, and where the bullet went through, if it did go through the drogue, they could highlight when it landed which gun had actually managed to get the hit. They used it for air-to-air gunnery with fighters as well. But one of the other things which a lot of people don't know about is we had Mersey forts, anti-aircraft and anti-surface shipping forts in the Mersey estuary, just like the ones which are still in the Thames estuary. We had 3 sets of them like this. And these were built in Liverpool, probably at Camel Lads. The bottom picture shows them being towed out, or one at a time being towed out by the tugs that were then sunk into the estuary, joined. You can see the walkways around them at the top and the guns on the top. And they were protecting the shipping. And also, of course, it was a good route for aircraft to come up towards Liverpool, to come up the river, because they would assume there were no guns down there. There was no ground from which to fire at them. So the forts, they also were cooperated with in the aircraft based at Woodvale. So we moved up from Spitfires. We still kept Spitfires at Woodvale with various squadrons. Hawker Typhoons, which were a more sophisticated, faster aircraft, started to come in. 2 squadrons came in to work up at Woodvale. They'd formed, and they were still building themselves into being a fighting unit, practicing air gunnery and shooting and tactics. So they would be at Woodvale for about 3 to 4 months and then move on to fight. I had a lot of trouble with them. They had a huge air intake at the front. And we always suffered at Woodvale with sand, because the grass never grew again properly until after the war. And a lot of the aircraft would suck sand into the engine, which would stop it. And one of the pilots was killed in a crash on the Formby Golf Club, what is now the Formby Golf Club, on the current club on the other side of the railway. He took off, the engine stopped, did a forced landing, and sadly died. He was a Canadian. This is his funeral. He's coming along the old Southport Road from the living sites. The bottom picture, the top picture is St. Peter's Church in Freshfield, where the grave is now. Not all the accidents were fatal. Had a lot of problems. If an aircraft, maybe the engine failed and it tried to land, couldn't make the runway, sometimes they would hit a rabbit hole. There are lots of rabbits at Woodvale, there still are. Or a problem with the aircraft, a bad landing, tipped up onto its nose. This was a Dutch squadron, 222 squadron, which operated out of Woodvale. You can see the tower in the background. But although it was busy with an active fighter squadron, at least one, and all these other training and cooperation squadrons, they had room to bring in yet another unit. And over in Grantham, there was number 12 Pilot Advanced Flying Training Unit, where they were training pilots to fly twin-engined aircraft in these Bristol Blenheim aircraft. It was a grass airfield. The weather was atrocious. It was boggy, muddy. They couldn't fly. They needed a hard runway. They needed decent weather. And for once, Woodvale was able to offer those facilities. So they brought over 16 aircraft, and they were there for about 3 months, flying out of Woodvale to keep these trainees training, because they needed them desperately, because they needed the crews desperately. They'd been trained in either South Africa or Canada in single-engined aircraft. They came over here to convert to twin-engined and move on to the operational aircraft. So early 1944, 16 of these operated out of Woodvale with trainees. And of course, the flying wasn't that good, and we had various accidents as well, but nobody killed, pleased to say. And the again, the support squadrons, 195 was an active squadron, 577 was a support squadron. They flew Hurricanes, so we had Hurricane Spitfires, Mosquitoes, Beaufighters, all sorts of aircraft operating out of Woodvale. Those 4 squadrons came along later to replace the Polish squadrons, one at a time. Then they would go back to the fighting, another one would come in, train up, move back, constant move of them. Beaufighter squadrons, 2 Beaufighter squadrons, and 2 Mosquitoes.
Aldon Ferguson.
And he's written a book, has he?
He's written this book. Well,
Somebody's unmuted. Could you mute, perhaps? Moving on, time's running away with us. There was a 4th Polish squadron arrived. It was 316 Squadron, which was named the city of Warsaw. They came across the Spitfires much later. If you look at the date there, February to April 1944, but for exactly the same reason and did exactly the same job. Sadly, I do not have a photograph of them at Woodvale, but they were there for those couple of months providing support to the Mersey, Manchester, North Wales, Lancaster, Barrow area, and then they went back to the fighting. Then we had, with that Red Cross Service Club, we had aircraft as big as this coming into Woodvale. This is a B-17 Flying Fortress, one of the 2 of the major American bombers during World War II. And these were bringing or taking people backwards and forwards to the Red Cross Service Club at the Palace Hotel. Also, we had the headquarters of Base Air Depot area, the headquarters of the support and the supply of all American aircraft in Southport. It was actually based in Imperial Hotel, and they needed personnel in and out, and they used Woodvale as their operating base until they moved over to Burton Wood. Eventually, they moved there and used that airfield. But in 1 week, in August 1944, an example of the visiting aircraft were 4 RAF Ansons, a Tiger Moth, a Miles Master training aircraft, 3 Miles Martinets, which were target tug aircraft, 2 UC-78 aircraft, which are American communications aircraft, 4 B-24 Liberators, which are same size as this aircraft, 2 of these B-17 Flying Fortresses, a visiting Spitfire, a Reliant, small American communications aircraft, and an A-20 Boston, a 2-engined American bomber. That was just 1 week in August 1944, which was typical. There were visitors coming and going constantly. So by the end of the war had gone away from Merseyside. There were no more bombing raids. The war was going on in Europe. We had obviously D-Day in June 44. The fighting was on the continent. There was no fighting in this area. There were no anti-aircraft guns, or very, very few. We didn't need the searchlights. They'd all been moved. So the reason for Woodvale being there was disappearing rapidly. So the RAF were prepared to give it up. And like many airfields, it could have just closed and gone forever. But the Navy decided they wanted Woodvale. So there was a big Navy air base at Burscough. The remains of it are still there. And that's the location there. It's on the Burscough Ormskirk Road, and they took it over. They were the Royal Naval Air Station Burscough, and they all have to have a name. They call them stone frigates because they were on the ground. They weren't actual ships, but they still had HMS names, and this was Ringtail. They're all named after birds. So Woodvale became Ringtail too, and this is a picture of a map of Burscough Airfield. They had 4 runways. Because on board a ship, an aircraft carrier, they can move the carrier so that it takes off, so that it's actually traveling into wind. So these runways are narrower than the RAF runways. An RAF runway was 150 feet wide. These were 100 feet wide, and they did their best to simulate aircraft carriers. But they took Woodvale over. They navalized it, changed all the names. The mess became a wardroom. The toilets became the heads. And it became known as Ringtail 2, or a tender to Ringtail. It was tacked on to the back of it. They drew dummy lines across, well, they made a dummy deck. They would paint out the size of an aircraft carrier deck onto the runway, and they would train pilots to land within that area. And not only did they paint lines to represent the arrestor wires, they actually put arrestor wires in And comparatively recently, I think it was probably 2 years ago, they were doing some repair work to the runway, and they found the remains of the tethering of some of these arrestor wires going across. So they were training naval crews. The war was still raging in the Far East. The Japanese had far from surrendered, and the Fleet Air Arm Squadrons anticipated they would be going to the Pacific. So 3 squadrons came into Woodvale, 899 Squadron flying these Hellcats, 816 flying Fireflies, and 822 flying Barracudas. And they operated out of Woodvale for up to 8 months, training up. Sometimes they would go onto a ship and do practice landings and taking offs on the ships, like the bottom picture, and they were ready to go to the Far East when the war ended quickly because of the atomic bombs in August. So here we have a typical crew from one of the Navy Fleet Air Arm Squadrons. That ended. They were not needed, so the Navy gave up Woodvale. They kept Glasgow for a while, and Woodvale suddenly became surplus. Woodvale was never bombed. No bombs ever actually hit it. The nearest, it is reputed that one hit the roundabout filling station at a Freshfield roundabout, but I can't prove it. But this is Pinfold Lane in Ainsdale, and this is the Cheshire Lines Railway. Woodvale Station's just up there to the right. And this house here was destroyed by this bomb which dropped here, and the explosion from the bomb damaged the house. That was probably the nearest. So we get to the end of the war. We get to VJ Day. Woodvale's not needed. Nobody wants our aircraft. Famous photograph, which then became several statues, down at the bottom right. In Liverpool, there was a huge motor transport company, which was like a squadron of ground crew who operated vehicles, trucks. And their responsibility was moving materials from Liverpool to or from Liverpool docks around all the different air bases in the northwest. And they operated from Sefton Park. Now Woodvale was available. So what do? They come down the road to Woodvale, and they had lots of hangars, they had lots of hard standing, lots of accommodation. So they took over the base. No aircraft, the airfield closed. They took over some of the living sites. The WAF site was taken over. They did have problems with flooding, but suddenly they were getting problems with squatters. A lot of the people who had been bombed out in Liverpool came out and they started squatting in the huts. They were not fit for it. At the same time, they were building a Royal Crescent in Formby, council houses, and they started to move the families out into the new council houses. And as they did, they pulled the buildings down. They kept the WAF quarters because they were the nicest, but they were the furthest away, and they were used for quite a while. Now they're all gone. There's the odd building. I think there's possibly one building left here used as a barn. So Woodvale was almost being given up, and Southport desperately wanted it as an airport. They made great play saying, we want to take Woodvale over, we want it to become Southport Airport. Formby were violently against it, and the two had some very acrimonious meetings. They went down to London as two totally separate parties, met with the Ministry of Aviation, put its case, Formby put its case, and they really fell out over this. Before really it was resolved for them by the RAF, and what they did was they reformed 611 Squadron, which was a fighter squadron. It was an auxiliary squadron, and they had formed before the war and became an integral part of fighter command during the war. You'll hear quite a lot more about 611 as I go on. I appreciate I'm running short on time. I'm sorry. I've got about 10 minutes left. Please bear with me. 611 Squadron, very successful Spitfire Squadron, and then Mustang Squadron during World War II. It had been formed at Speke, and it's like the TA in that nearly all, except for Okada and a few regulars, all the members were volunteers. And so they would fly at weekends. And during the war, they were immediately integrated into the full Air Force. So they were actually called up, if you like. But when they reformed at Woodvale in 1946, it was purely volunteers. It was May 1946. They reformed it on paper. They were going to give them Spitfires, but it took them nearly a year before the first Spitfires arrived. But to give them something to fly, they gave them some trainers, some Harvard trainers. During the war, the code letter had been FY. Now it was a reserve unit, and they had 3 of these Harvard trainers, and they would be training and continuation training, because all their pilots had been pilots during the war. They were qualified pilots. They just needed to keep in practice. So they slowly equipped them with Spitfires. The first commanding officer was Jack Leather, who is here in the centre of this group. They're on summer camp here with a Spitfire in the background. And he had been a pilot with the squadron during the war. All those pilots on this photograph have got medals. They were all wartime people. And this is a drogue chute that they towed behind the target tug aircraft I was talking about before. They would tow this behind a tug, and the aircraft would shoot at it. And here they are examining it. And it was not unknown for them to shoot at it, come back and look at it and check it out and find no one had touched it, hadn't been hit. But back at Woodvale, they were getting more sophisticated aircraft, 5-bladed prop on a Mark 22. This is Woodvale, St George's School in the background in Freshfield there. And they were getting a more sophisticated aircraft. And they would operate at weekends, and they would do a lot of cooperation work with the RAF, and they would operate in all the major exercises. And they were very efficient as a fighter squadron. Simultaneously, there was a cadet gliding school at Woodvale. Here you can see the control tower and the 2 hangars. I'm going to talk about this hangar in a minute, because that hangar wasn't there during the war. But in 1951, 611 Squadron converted to Meteors, jet fighters, and they had new insignia, really colourful. It was red, black, and white. Yellow, sorry. The light is a yellow colour. And these are the early Meteor Mark IV, operated from Woodvale for a short while. And to do that, they had to build that second hangar, because these aircraft had high tails. So here we have an aerial view of Woodvale in the days before they bothered to tone it down. And what they did is they extended the runway by 600 feet. The main runway ended there. They extended it towards Southport, and they built this second hangar to house these Meteors. Now, when the RAF starts spending money, it normally means they're going to close a place down. Fortunately, that didn't happen here. But what they did is they did a swap, and the Meteors didn't last for long. And what they did is they moved the Meteors from Woodvale to RAF Houghton Park, which is where the Vauxhall factory is now on the Wirral. And they did a swap. The aircraft which were at Houghton Park moved to Woodvale, and the Meteors from Woodvale went to Houghton Park, where they joined another Meteor squadron, which was 610 Squadron, the City of Chester Squadron. So the Meteor was a sophisticated fighter, a jet. So they decided they'd operate the 2 squadrons together, and in return, they would bring the 3 units at Houghton Park across to Woodvale. The first one was the Thumb flight, which was a meteorological flight. Liverpool University Air Squadron 19 Reserve Flying School. Now, I'm going to race a bit through the last few slides. The Thumb flight stood for temperature and humidity. Basically, the house in the background, before I go on, this is the clubhouse of the Liverpool Merchant Banking and Insurance Golf Club. And that's the Polish officers' mess during the war. And when this picture was taken in 1957, it was still there. This flight had 3 Spitfires. It was operated by Short Brothers, a civilian company, but they were RAF aircraft. And one would take off every morning, 8 o'clock, and they would fly down towards Hereford. And it would be taking meteorological readings, weather readings, the temperature, the humidity, the pressure, and various other readings as part of our weather forecasting. And they would initially come back to Woodvale, and they would telephone through the information to the meteorological office at Dunstable. Then they started to stop at Speke on the way back, and they would then send all the information by teleprinter. This flight operated at Woodvale from 1951 through to 1957. And John Formby, who lived in Formby at the time, and one of the Formby family, lovely guy, I met him many times. He flew 462 of those daily sorties, just one a day, one of the 3 aircraft. They lasted until June 1957. The aircraft rotated a bit. They lost 2 aircraft in crashes, and they lost 2 pilots, unfortunately, who were killed as well. The last 3 pilots, including John Formby on the right there, they were there the day they phased these 3 Spitfires out. Those 3 Spitfires became the RAF historic aircraft flight, which now is the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Two of the aircraft are still flying with the RAF Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. The other one is still flying with Rolls-Royce. And they had a ceremony and they had an air display to celebrate it in June 1957. They were replaced with Mosquitoes. This is a Mosquito, top left. This needed a crew of two. But on the very, very last thumb flight, they were being replaced. Don't forget, we didn't have satellites in these days, but they replaced them with different means of balloons. And a propeller blade from a Spitfire, which had crashed on the airfield. But what the one blade which wasn't damaged was presented to Short Brothers. And Freddie Chapman here was the manager of Short Brothers. He celebrated his 100th birthday last August. And John Formby is there, and the ground crew and the AOC of 64 support group here presented that propeller blade. Sadly, that blade is in the Solent Air Museum. It should be at Woodvale. That was the thumb flight, very important flight, and the record it held, and that Woodvale holds, is it was the very last regular RAF unit to fly the Spitfire in the UK. Liverpool University Air Squadron came in, and also shortly afterwards joined by Manchester University Air Squadron, which changed its name to include Salford. And they flew the Chipmunk aircraft. Some of them became quite colourful later on, and they were training university students, many of whom had RAF scholarships. They were going to join the RAF, but before they joined, they got their degrees, or they would take people from university and train them to fly, basically, and give them a grounding in the RAF so that they had support from educated people in the future once they graduated. But it also saved quite a lot of the time in their basic training. Those aircraft, the Spitfire, the Chipmunk was replaced by the Bulldog, which was somewhat more sophisticated, and in time, the Grob Tutor, which is still flown by the University Air Squadrons at Woodvale. The other unit was a flying training school, which was training pilots in, not training, but it was in case of a war. It was people in the reserve who may be called up. Some of them were called up for the Korean crisis. And the pilots, single engine pilots, would can do continuity training in the Chipmunk, and navigators, engineers, and twin engine pilots in the twin engine aircraft. They lasted until 54 at Woodvale. Well, we had air shows at Woodvale. This is a 1954 program, 53 program. And they had another big one in 1957 when they celebrated the Spitfires leaving. I'm nearly there. Air experience to fly cadets, to give air cadets air experience. This was 10 AEF. You can see the map on the side of the tower here, still there in these days. That was formed in 1958, and that merged into Manchester University Air Squadron. They share the aircraft, but every weekend you're getting air cadets under normal circumstances, not with COVID, getting air experience at Woodvale and other airfields around the country for air cadets. And the last unit really was the CACU, Civilian Anti-Aircraft Cooperation Unit. They operated Meteors for a long time, 58 to 91, and they were working with the Army and missile and anti-aircraft gunnery ranges. They would fly across to ranges in North Wales or way up into Benbecula, up in the Hebrides. We'd see these Meteors. They had about 5 on strength at any one time. They were flying very, very regularly. Woodvale saw lots and lots of visitors. The Red Arrows appeared here several times. In the old days, they would land here. The bottom picture on the left there shows them lined up on the runway with a Hercules support aircraft. Unfortunately, the original, my photograph has faded. That's the best I can do. They were here for the Southport Flower Show. They operated from Woodvale for the Flower Show. The Goodyear airship stopped a bit of traffic on the bypass. Here we have it operated for a week out of Woodvale. Lots of different types coming and going. Of course, it's the only military airfield in the northwest now. The Merseyside police helicopters operated from Woodvale for a long, long time until a cost-cutting exercise got rid of them, sadly. 2011, which was the 70th anniversary of Woodvale. Woodvale was given the freedom of entry into Sefton, and here we have the mayor who is granting it, and some of the University Squadron air cadets. And on the 75th anniversary, we unveiled a plaque at the more or less the end of the main runway, the Formby end. And here we have Wing Commander Hooton, who is the station commander now, and we have Neil Blair, the station warrant officer, and Reg York, who was the chair of the Formby Historical Society. Sadly, he's passed away. But this plaque is there. I hope it's still there. It was dedicated on this day in December 2016, 75th anniversary of Woodvale, and it's in memory of all those who were killed while operating from Woodvale. Then 611 Squadron, it had disbanded in 1957 at Houghton Park. They lost their meteors. They just disappeared. But in 2013, they came back. And they came back under Squadron Leader Hallard, who is here. And he and I worked together to pull together some of the history and get the Squadron silver back, etc. And here is one of the early Squadron dinners. We had the privilege, or I had the privilege of attending with them the dedication of the memorial in St John's Gardens in Liverpool in November 2019. And here we have the current CO on the left-hand side there, Group Captain Cheskin, who is taking the salute. We had the Lord Lieutenant of Merseyside, and we had, who's on the left here, and the lady, the Lord Mayor of Liverpool here as well. We also had a widow of a World War II Battle of Britain pilot who flew with 611 Squadron, Lady Joan Heath. The Squadron today, it's still at Woodvale. Pictures of the top within their headquarters. The CO is on the left, Wing Commander Chaskin, and Squadron Leader Lee is on the right-hand side. It's his wedding anniversary today, but he is in quarantine for COVID, unfortunately. But what they're holding is the tally board. This is it's a cross off a German aircraft which was shot down by the Squadron over North Wales during the war. The crew went out, took this off the bottom of the wing, and every aircraft which was shot down by the Squadron is annotated on it, the date and who shot it down, and the CO's names are on it. And this is held at the RAF Museum, but the Squadron are holding it at the moment. So today at Woodvale, we have the Auxiliary Squadron, which again is like you would think of a TA. They have a regular corps of officers, and the majority of the members are part-time. They have normal jobs. They are volunteers. They operate weekends, but they have a job with the military. Many of them are serving today on temporary duty with the RAF in different parts of the world, and they're there to be called up in case of emergency. Very active squadron, wonderful group of people. I act as their historian, but they're a lovely group of people. Liverpool University Air Squadron are there with their Grobs and the Manchester One. It's the headquarters of the Merseyside wing of the Air Training Corps. There is an Air Training Corps squadron there, which is now 611 Squadron. I started my days with them, and there's also a civilian group. So, Woodvale, within the military, not many people have ever heard of it, known only to a few, but forgotten by none. And that's a little picture of the control tower, the pine woods in the background, the crash vehicle shed here, which used to be the barn, and the picture on the side of the tower and the radio towers. And that was on a glass, which were done specially for a celebration dinner several years ago. So I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I'm way over my time, but in a nutshell, that's 80 years of Woodvale. Thank you very, very much for joining me.
Oh, thanks, Aldon. That was such a wonderful history of a sector I think most of us still recognise today. And to actually learn that it's just been going for so long, it's absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much for that. Can I just ask, the Polish squadrons, did they fly with the RAF or was they autonomous?
No, they flew as RAF squadrons. When they went back to places like Northolt, they were flying with RAF squadrons. And normally they would operate as a group of squadrons. They call them a group, a wing. You might get 2 or 3 squadrons operating simultaneously. But initially they were a bit wild, and they would go for a kill if they possibly could. And if they were told to hang back, don't do this, don't leave the group of aircraft which would act together as protection, they would pretend they don't understand, no understand English, and they would go off and do their thing. They were wild, but they they did a fantastic job. But no, it was like 308 Squadron RAF. They were part of the RAF, but they would give them as much Polish. They would try and make as much of it Polish as all the crews and the ground crew to give them an entity. And it wasn't just Polish. They had Czech squadrons. They had Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, all sorts of different ones.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that came very clear to me very quick when I was researching for the exhibition was the Poles were fighting a different fight. I mean, we were fighting because obviously, you know, we didn't want to become occupied, but they had already experienced that, and they were fighting for families and loved ones back home. So there was definitely a different thing going on, which I thoroughly understand that. So we've had a few questions come through. So if you want to take a moment to have a look at them, I will just quickly do a show.
How can I can't see them, sorry.
Oh, just click on the chat icon and they should come up.
Chat. Okay.
While you're having a fiddle, I'll just do a call out for the next couple of talks.
Right.
So we've got the 4th of August at 7 o'clock. It's the Next Ancient World talk, and that is about Howard Carter. The speaker is Claire Rollett, and she's from the University of Liverpool. And that should be really fascinating because Claire is quite obsessed with Howard Carter. And one of the things she's really interested in is his life running up to the discovery of Tutankhamun. So that's when obviously everybody knows his story, but it's that bit that makes that man, that makes that discovery. So that should be really interesting. And on the 11th of August at 1 o'clock, which is our next lunchtime talk, it's a talk by Sahel Sheikh. And if any of you've actually been to the exhibition yet, you will have seen that central to the exhibition is this beautiful sculpture of a replica Spitfire. And Sahel is actually the gentleman that made that. He's a wonderful artist who's based in France, does a lot of other work, but has become quite obsessed with aviation in the last few years. So he's going to be chatting to us about some of the work that he's been doing, and he's also quite a history buff as well, and the research he put into the sculpture. He describes it as not as a sculpture, but as a moment in time, and it's supposed to represent a Polish ace who is called Jerzy Stanislaw Zielinski. And what he's done is he's actually set this sculpture, the whole, the flight deck of the airplane is actually kitted out with the right time, the right airspeed, the right everything at this moment in time when this pilot's just about to encounter a German bomber. So it's absolutely stunning. So I will pass over to Aldon now, if you've had a chance to look at some of the questions.
Yes, there's a few here. Kevin Burke has said, were there any female pilots at Woodvale? Well, no, not with the active squadrons. They were just not allowed to fly with the active squadrons during the war, but we had the Air Transport Auxiliary, and there were many female pilots with them, many. And in fact, they were based, their headquarters was just up the road from where I live now. It was White Waltham, just near Maidenhead. They flew every single type, from a Tiger Moth little two-seat biplane right through to a Lancaster. And they would have flown aircraft into Woodvale, which were being delivered from the factories or the maintenance units, or come to take away like a Mark I when it was being replaced with a Mark II. And they saved the job of a lot of the service pilots who were busy fighting or training. They didn't have time to act as ferry pilots, although some did. So the Air Transport Auxiliary, also known as Ancient and Tatty Airmen, or Anything to Anywhere, ATA, but it stood for Air Transport Auxiliary, that was manned by people who were not eligible to fly with the regular Royal Air Force. In fact, one guy only had one arm. Some people had glasses, had very poor eyesight, not very poor, but not good eyesight, or they were a foreign national who would not be accepted by the RAF. A lot of women, because they were not allowed to fly with the RAF on operations. There's quite a lot of documentation about it. One of the ladies has a wonderful name, Lettice Curtis was her name. She's written 2 books all about her life as an air transport pilot. So in brief, no operational female pilots at Woodvale, but female pilots would have come in. Now it's totally different. You get females with the university air squadrons, and they're treated totally as equals to the men, no problem at all. Julie Kershaw was asking if there's a Chindit close in Formby. Was there a Chindit unit based by? Not that I'm aware of. In Formby, we used to have a huge barracks, Harrington Barracks, which ran between, well, where Harrington Road runs now, between Victoria Road and Formby Station. Well, that was the King's Regiment from Liverpool. I'm not aware of any Chindits being in the area. I've lived in Formby many years. I know Chindit Close, but I don't know where the name came from. Ken always has something to say, don't you, Ken? Interesting before Navy aircraft. I should have pointed out the one on the bottom right, the only picture I had, in fact, was with an American insignia on it. And Ken's telling us it was only. It was
at Chesapeake.
Sorry, Chesapeake.
Yeah.
But we did actually fly more than one Chesapeake. But
the only squadron was actually based at Ringtail.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right, and then Kevin Burke is making a comment about his X-12 squadron. Sadly, he didn't serve at Woodvale. The weather flights, I remember those weather flights clearly because I lived in Freshfield then, and very, very quickly on those weather flights, they flew the last one. They had the ceremony and those photographs, a lot of photographs. The next morning, they were going to fly them away. They were going to Coltishall in Norfolk, where this historic flight was being formed. One of them wouldn't start. One of them took off and had what we call a mag drop. The engine started to lose power, and he decided he needed to land. And so he came back and landed, couldn't make the runway, landed on the grass, and did hit a rabbit hole and tipped it up on its nose. And it was the one propeller blade still standing up, which was the one in that photograph. The third one, they decided, well, one wouldn't start, one's faulty, the third one, let's not risk it. So they never took off that day. They repaired the two, and they took off individually later and formed that flight. So it was a sad loss, but we did have a big air display to celebrate the loss, and those aircraft are still flying, and it is a great bonus to Woodvale that the last three regular routine Spitfires flew out of Woodvale on a regular basis. John Formby passed away, sadly, many years ago. When he retired, he had a canal boat, and he came from Runcorn, or he retired in Runcorn. But when he came down to Reading, he moored up at Reading, and he had his logbooks. And he called me up, and I went and I met him again, had a long, long conversation. I borrowed his logbooks, I copied them. I've got photocopies of all his logbooks. He had something like 12,000 hours of flying in the end. An amazing man.
He actually flew the last mosquito. I've only just found out he actually flew the last mosquito thumb flight as well.
Did he? Right.
Yeah, I've only found that out last week.
Right. I'll have a look at that because I got his logbook, so that'll prove it. Recording from G. Will there be a recording? I'm told it's going on YouTube, but I'll leave that to Joe to tell us about it. Martin Wilkinson lived under the flight path, Penfold Lane. Yes. We have the Shackletons. We used to get Shackletons coming in from the Coastal Command aircraft, from the Coastal Command bases, which were at the extreme parts of the country, Kinloss up in Scotland, St Morgan in Cornwall, Ballykelly in Northern Ireland. They would fly as a taxi, Christmas and Easter. They would bring people down to Liverpool for leave, and they would come in on, say, the Thursday before Easter, drop off a whole crowd of people who would then get the bus to Liverpool for Easter leave, and then pick them up again the next week and fly them back. They called it an exercise, but they were big aircraft to land at Woodvale. The other thing were those CACU, the Civilian Anti-Aircraft Cooperation Meteors. I remember being in a house in Ainsdale when one came into land, and they are noisy. When they come into land, they're noisy. So, Shackletons were one of many, many visitors. John Crosby's telling us many from the Kings were in the Chindits in Burma. Okay, fine. So there must be a link there somewhere. There must be. And that's all, Joe, on this list.
Lovely. Oh, thank you all for that. Yes, what we're going to do is Aldon's kindly agreed that we've been recording the talk today, and we will be putting it on YouTube. If you want to see it, it should be ready in a few days. And what you have to do is you go onto the Atkinson's website, go into events. There is a box where it says regular events, and if you click in that, you'll see where the talks are, and you just click on the relevant talk and you can rewatch it. And Aldon's kindly agreed to leave it on for the duration of the exhibition, which runs through to March next year. So thank you all for joining us today. If you haven't been to the exhibition, please come along and see it. We're up Monday to Saturday 10 till 4. There's lots of other things on as well. We've literally just opened a Red Room exhibition at the same time. So thank you for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you all again soon. And thank you, Aldon, so much for today. Really appreciate it, and hope you can come down and see us as well.
I'm dying to see the exhibition. Yes, please. Don't
That's
forget the book, everybody. The books are going to be available in the Atkinson.
Yes,
go and see the exhibition and buy the book.
Of course. Okay, so thank you all, and thanks, Aldon, and we'll see you all again soon. Take care.
Thanks, Joe.